The bell above Murphy's Sports Haven chimed weakly as another customer left empty-handed, the sound echoing through the cramped storefront like a death rattle. Frank Murphy wiped his weathered hands on his faded Cincinnati Reds apron and glanced at the antiquated cash register. Only $43 in sales today, and it was already past 3 in the afternoon on what should have been a busy Tuesday. The autumn Cincinnati wind rattled the storefront windows with increasing intensity, carrying with it the scent of fallen leaves, distant diesel fumes, and the melancholy promise of another harsh Midwest winter approaching. Frank had inherited this small sports memorabilia shop from his father 28 years ago, back when the neighborhood still buzzed with middle-class activity and kids actually played baseball in the streets instead of staring at glowing screens all day. The surrounding blocks had been filled with family-owned businesses then: Murphy's Sports Haven, Chen's Chinese Restaurant, O'Malley's Corner Bar, Rodriguez Family Grocery, and Tommy's Electronics. Now, at 54, with salt and pepper hair that seemed to grey more each month and deep lines etched around his eyes like a roadmap of worry, he was watching his life's work slowly crumble like yesterday's newspaper left in the rain. The shop itself told the story of better times. Faded pennants from championship seasons hung from the ceiling, their colors bleached by fluorescent lights that hummed constantly and flickered when the building's electrical system acted up. Glass display cases lined the walls, their surfaces clouded with age and filled with treasures that fewer and fewer people seemed to appreciate. Vintage baseball cards in protective sleeves, signed photographs of Reds legends like Johnny Bench and Joe Morgan, game-used bats with the worn spots where professional hands had gripped them thousands of times, and jerseys that had witnessed moments of athletic greatness now relegated to gathering dust. "Dad, we need to talk." "Dees," his daughter Sarah emerged from the cramped back office, her face grave as she clutched a manila folder stuffed with bills, late notices, and legal documents. At 26, she had inherited her mother's determined chin and her father's stubborn streak. But lately, those traits felt more like burdens than blessings. Her business degree from Cincinnati State had prepared her for corporate spreadsheets and strategic planning, not for the heartbreaking arithmetic of a family business slowly bleeding to death. Frank didn't look up from the dusty display case he was cleaning for the 3rd time that day, a nervous habit he'd developed since Margaret's death. Inside, faded baseball cards sat next to signed photographs of Reds legends, their prices marked down for the 3rd time this month in red ink that seemed to mock his desperation. "If it's about the rent, I already know we're behind." Mrs. Patterson from the real estate office called this morning. "It's not just the rent, Dad, it's everything." Sarah spread the papers across the counter like a poker dealer laying out a losing hand, each document representing another piece of their American dream slipping away. "The electricity bill is 2 months overdue, the insurance premium is due next week, and the loan payment on Mum's medical expenses." Her voice caught. "We owe $8,473, and that's just what's officially overdue. There are other bills coming due that we haven't even opened yet." The mention of his late wife, twisted something deep in Frank's chest, a familiar pain that had never really healed. Margaret had fought lung cancer for 2 brutal years, and even with their health insurance, the treatments, the experimental drugs, the countless trips to specialists in Columbus and Cleveland had drained their savings account, forced them to take a second mortgage on the house, and ultimately led them to borrow against the shop itself. She'd been gone 6 months now, but the bills kept coming like persistent ghosts demanding payment for borrowed time. "I know things are tight, sweetheart, but Christmas season is coming. People buy sports memorabilia for gifts. Maybe we can—" "Tight." Sarah's voice cracked with frustration and exhaustion. "Dad, Mrs. Chen from the Chinese restaurant next door told me the landlord's been asking questions about our lease, checking to see if we're current on payments. Tommy's Electronics down the block already got evicted last month, and they'd been here longer than us. We're not just tight, we're drowning, and I don't know how much longer we can keep our heads above water." Frank finally looked up, seeing his own fears reflected in his daughter's worried brown eyes, so much like her mother's that it sometimes took his breath away. Sarah had given up her promising marketing job in Columbus to help him through Margaret's illness, and had stayed afterward to try saving the shop. The guilt of watching her sacrifice her future for his dying dream ate at him daily, a corrosive shame that made every small victory feel hollow. The afternoon sun slanted through the grimy windows, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the air like tiny spirits of better times. The shop smelled of old leather, cardboard, and the faint antiseptic scent that seemed to cling to everything since Margaret's illness. as if the sterile hospital smell had followed them home and taken up permanent residence. Baseball bats lined one wall, their wood worn smooth by countless hands that had once dreamed of greatness. Shelves held team pennants, bobbleheads that no one bought anymore, and boxes of trading cards that kids used to purchase with their allowance money back when allowances meant something, and kids still collected physical objects. The neighborhood around them was changing too. Young professionals were moving into the renovated lofts and condos closer to downtown, but they shopped online for everything and seemed to view physical retail stores as quaint anachronisms. The working-class families, who had been the backbone of small businesses like Murphy's, were being priced out, moving to suburbs where big box stores and strip malls offered cheaper prices and more convenient parking. "Maybe it's time, Sarah." Frank's voice was barely a whisper, the words feeling like surrender. "Maybe your mother was trying to tell us something during those long nights in the hospital. She kept saying I should think about retirement, about us having a real life together, somewhere warm like Florida or Arizona, somewhere we could start fresh." Sarah reached across the counter and squeezed her father's calloused hand, feeling the roughness of decades spent handling sporting goods and memorabilia. "Mom also said you'd never forgive yourself if you gave up on this place without a real fight. She said baseball was in your blood, and blood doesn't just dry up and disappear. She believed in what you were doing here, Dad. She believed in preserving these stories, keeping this history alive." The bell chimed again, interrupting their conversation with a sound that had once meant hope and possibility, but now felt more like an intrusion. Both turned to see Mrs. Rodriguez enter with her grandson Miguel, a serious 8-year-old with thick glasses and an oversized Cincinnati Reds jersey that hung to his knees like a hand-me-down from an older brother. Miguel's face lit up when he saw Frank, the way kids' faces used to light up in toy stores before everything moved online. Frank forced a smile and straightened up, slipping back into the role he'd played thousands of times over the years. The friendly neighborhood shopkeeper who had infinite patience for young baseball fans and their dreams. "Hey there, Miguel! How's the batting practice going, slugger?" The boy beamed, his serious demeanor melting away like ice cream on a summer day. "I hit 3 balls over the fence yesterday at the community center. Grandma says if I keep practicing hard and eating my vegetables, maybe I can play for the Reds someday, just like Johnny Bench." "That's the spirit, young man. Every great player started exactly where you are now, with a dream and the willingness to work for it. What can I help you two find today, Mrs.?" Rodriguez smiled apologetically, the expression of a grandmother on a fixed income trying to make a small budget stretch to cover a child's dreams. "He's been saving his birthday money for 3 weeks, wants to buy something special for his room, something that will inspire him to keep practicing." Frank watched as Miguel wandered the narrow aisles with the wonder of an explorer discovering buried treasure, touching items with the reverence of a pilgrim in a shrine. His small hands traced the signatures on autographed baseballs, examined the grain of wooden bats, and studied the faces in old team photographs as if memorizing the features of his heroes. This was why Frank couldn't give up. Not yet. This shop wasn't just about baseball cards and autographed jerseys. It was about keeping dreams alive in a world that seemed increasingly determined to crush them under the weight of practicality and economic reality. Miguel spent 10 minutes carefully examining different items, weighing their relative merits with the seriousness of a major league general manager making a trade deadline decision. Finally, he selected a Pete Rose rookie card from the discount bin, his eyes wide as he counted out crumpled dollar bills and quarters with the solemnity of a business transaction that would determine his financial future. Frank accepted the money, but slipped an extra signed photograph into the bag, a black and white shot of old Riverfront Stadium in its heyday, when Cincinnati baseball meant something to the whole country. "For future study," he told the boy with a conspiratorial wink. "Every great player needs to understand the history of the game, where it came from, and what made it special." "Thank you, Mr. Murphy." Miguel clutched the bag like it contained the crown jewels. "I'm going to put the Pete Rose card right next to my bed so I can see it every morning when I wake up." After they left, the shop fell quiet again, except for the persistent hum of the old fluorescent lights and the distant sound of traffic on Vine Street. Sarah had returned to the back office, probably trying to figure out which bills they could delay payment on this month and which ones absolutely had to be paid to keep the lights on. Frank stood alone among the artifacts of America's pastime, feeling like the last guardian of something precious and rapidly disappearing from the world. His phone buzzed with a text message from his brother Jim in Florida. Offer still stands, Frank. Partnership in the marina business down here. Good money, warm weather, and no more worrying about rent or inventory or whether people still care about baseball cards. Think about it seriously this time. Frank had been avoiding that conversation for months, deleting similar messages and letting Jim's calls go to voicemail. But maybe it was time to face the reality that his brother had been living comfortably while Frank struggled to keep a dream alive that fewer and fewer people shared. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, painting the storefront in shades of orange and gold that reminded him of summer evenings at Old Crosley Field, where his father had first taken him to see the Reds play when Frank was Miguel's age. Those memories felt simultaneously like yesterday and a lifetime ago, when baseball was still America's undisputed pastime and small businesses like his thrived in neighborhoods across the country. His father had been a machinist at a factory that no longer existed, but he'd loved baseball with the passion of someone who understood that the game represented something larger than itself: hope, tradition, the possibility that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things through dedication and skill. The register drawer stuck when Frank tried to close it, another small repair he couldn't afford to fix. Everything in the shop was like that now, held together by hope and stubbornness rather than proper maintenance. The air conditioning had been running on borrowed time for 2 summers, the carpet was worn thin in the high traffic areas, and the security system beeped intermittently with a malfunction no one could afford to diagnose. But as Frank looked around at the faded glory surrounding him, he wasn't ready to surrender. Not yet. Margaret's voice seemed to whisper in the dust motes and shadows. "Frank Murphy, you've never quit anything in your life. Don't start now when that little boy needs you to keep his dreams alive." She'd always been the practical one, handling the bookkeeping and insurance while he focused on the romance of the business. But she'd also understood that Murphy's Sports Haven was more than a store. It was a repository of stories, a place where fathers brought sons to touch pieces of history and dream about greatness. Tomorrow he would make some calls, maybe visit the bank about restructuring their loans or extending payment schedules. He'd swallow his pride and ask Jim for advice about business options, even though accepting help from his successful brother felt like admitting failure. Tonight, he would go home to his empty house and try to figure out how to honor Margaret's memory while still being realistic about their impossible situation. The shop had been their whole life together, their shared dream of creating something that mattered, and letting it go felt like losing her all over again. As he reached for the light switch, Frank caught sight of his reflection in the front window, a tired man in his 50s, standing among the shadows of his dreams, still holding on when logic and accounting said to let go. Outside, Cincinnati continued its evening rhythm, indifferent to the small dramas playing out in storefront windows across the city, where other small business owners were probably facing similar, impossible equations of love versus money, dreams versus reality. Frank Murphy turned off the lights and locked the door, but he didn't lock away the hope that somehow tomorrow would bring something different, something that would remind him why he'd spent 30 years believing that preserving baseball's history was worth fighting for, even when the fight seemed impossible to win. Tuesday morning arrived gray and humid, with clouds hanging low over Cincinnati like a damp blanket that promised rain but never quite delivered. Frank had been at the shop since 7, reorganizing inventory and trying to make the sparse shelves look fuller than they were, a retail magician's trick he'd perfected over years of economic uncertainty. The morning radio droned in the background, a familiar mix of traffic reports, weather forecasts, and desultory talk about the Cincinnati Reds' disappointing season that had ended 3 weeks ago with more questions than answers. The DJ was interviewing a local sports columnist about the team's prospects for next year, but Frank had heard variations of the same conversation every autumn for the past decade, promising young players, veteran leadership, hopes for improvement, and the eternal optimism that somehow next season would be different. It was the background soundtrack of his life, as constant and unremarkable as the traffic noise outside. Sarah arrived at 9 with coffee from the McDonald's drive-thru and the grim determination of someone facing an unpleasant task with no choice but to push forward. She'd spent the evening making phone calls to creditors, negotiating payment plans and extensions with the practiced diplomacy of someone who'd become expert at explaining why they deserved one more chance. The conversations had bought them a little more time, but not much, temporary reprieves that felt like putting bandages on wounds that needed surgery. "I talked to the bank," she said, settling behind the counter with her laptop and a stack of manila folders that represented their financial lifeline. Mr. Harrison says they'll extend the loan deadline 2 weeks if we can show good faith with a partial payment. That means we need at least $2,000 by next Friday, which gives us exactly 10 days to find money we don't have. Frank nodded grimly, though they both knew that $2,000 might as well have been $2 million given their current sales trajectory. Yesterday's receipts had totaled $37. Miguel's Pete Rose rookie card purchase and a few packs of current trading cards sold to teenagers who would probably leave them unopened in bedroom drawers until they went to college and their mothers threw them away. The morning crawled by with the usual trickle of browsers and tire kickers who treated the shop more like a free museum than a place of business. A collector from Lexington called about a Johnny Bench autographed jersey, but balked at the price when Frank quoted him the already reduced figure. 2 teenagers spent 20 minutes handling merchandise with the casual disregard of people who had no intention of buying anything, then left to purchase cheaper versions online using their phones. By noon, they'd made exactly $18, enough to buy lunch, but not enough to pay any bills that mattered. Frank was pricing a new shipment of Cincinnati Reds memorabilia when the bell chimed with its familiar tired sound. He looked up to see a man in his early 70s enter, wearing well-worn jeans, a plain white t-shirt, and a Cincinnati Reds baseball cap pulled low over silver hair that suggested someone who'd spent considerable time outdoors. Nothing particularly remarkable about him, just another middle-aged guy probably killing time before meeting his wife at the mall or running errands around town. "Good afternoon," Frank called out automatically, returning to his inventory sheets. "Let me know if you need help finding anything specific or if you have questions about any of the items." The customer nodded politely and began browsing slowly, methodically examining items with what Frank recognized as a collector's careful attention to detail. His movements were deliberate and economical, like someone who'd spent years making split-second decisions under pressure. He picked up a vintage Louisville Slugger bat, testing its weight and balance with the kind of familiarity that suggested more than casual interest in baseball equipment. "Nice piece," the man said, his voice carrying a slight rasp that spoke of years of outdoor work or maybe too many cigarettes. "Louisville Slugger circa 1975. Good wood grain, properly aged. You can tell this one saw some serious use." Frank looked up with interest, his attention fully engaged for the first time all day. Most casual browsers couldn't tell a genuine vintage bat from a modern reproduction, much less comment knowledgeably on wood grain and aging characteristics. "You know your equipment. Did you play ball yourself?" A slight smile crossed the man's weathered face, an expression that suggested memories of better times. "Once upon a time. Long time ago, though. Different world back then. Wooden bats, real grass. Players who stayed with one team their whole careers." He continued browsing while Frank returned to his paperwork, but something about the customer nagged at him like a half-remembered song. There was something familiar in the man's stance, the way he held the bat, a certain quiet confidence that reminded Frank of something he couldn't quite place. The customer moved through the shop with the easy familiarity of someone who'd spent time around professional sporting goods, examining items with an expert's eye for authenticity and quality. Sarah emerged from the back office, probably planning to grab lunch from the sandwich shop down the block, and stopped short when she saw the customer examining a display of Pete Rose memorabilia with unusual intensity. The man was studying a signed photograph of Rose sliding into home plate with the focused attention of someone analyzing a piece of fine art or reviewing an important document. "That's a great shot," Sarah said, approaching with her practiced sales smile and the professional demeanor she'd developed during her brief corporate career. Pete Rose, sliding into home plate, 1975 World Series against the Boston Red Sox. "My dad always says Rose was the embodiment of Cincinnati baseball, all heart, no quit, and absolutely no fear of getting dirty if it meant winning." The customer looked up, and for just a moment Frank caught something in his eyes, amusement maybe, or recognition, as if he were sharing a private joke with himself. "Your dad's got good taste and good judgment. Rose was something special, all right. Had his faults, sure, but nobody ever played harder or wanted to win more than that guy. You could see it in every at-bat, every slide, every time he ran to first base on a walk." "You sound like you might have seen him play in person," Frank said, joining the conversation and studying the customer more carefully. "Oh, I saw him plenty. Watched him break Ty Cobb's record right here in Cincinnati, September 11th, 1985. Incredible night. The whole city went absolutely crazy. People were crying, strangers were hugging each other, grown men were acting like kids on Christmas morning." The man's eyes grew distant with memory, as if he were replaying the scene in his mind. Course, that was before all the trouble started, before the gambling scandal and the banishment. Different times. Frank nodded knowingly, feeling the familiar mixture of pride and sadness that every Cincinnati baseball fan experienced when discussing Pete Rose. Always figured Rose got a raw deal, personally. Yeah, he screwed up, made some terrible decisions, but the man gave everything to this game, played every single day like it was Game 7 of the World Series. That's got to count for something. The customer picked up a Pete Rose rookie card, handling it with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts or family heirlooms. The price tag read $500, a figure that reflected both the card's rarity and Frank's desperate need to generate revenue. 500, huh? Market's been soft on Rose stuff since the gambling scandal broke. Shame, really. His numbers speak for themselves. Frank felt heat rise in his cheeks, embarrassed by the high price, but unable to explain that he needed every dollar he could get. Yeah, well, controversy tends to hurt collectible values, unfortunately. It's a shame, really. The guy's got more legitimate baseball accomplishments than half the players in the Hall of Fame. More than half, the customer agreed quietly, his voice carrying a weight of personal knowledge. But that's baseball for you, isn't it? Sometimes the game forgives your mistakes, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you get remembered for your worst moment instead of your best seasons. Something in his tone made Frank study him more carefully. The man had the bearing and physical presence of an ex-athlete, not just someone who'd played high school ball or weekend softball, but someone who'd lived in that rarefied atmosphere of professional sports. The way he moved, the way he assessed the memorabilia with expert eyes, even the way he wore his baseball cap suggested someone who'd been around the game at its highest levels. "You mind me asking what you did before retirement?" Frank asked, his curiosity genuinely engaged. The customer smiled, but the expression didn't quite reach his eyes, as if he were used to deflecting personal questions. "This and that. Traveled a lot for work, spent a lot of time in hotels, a lot of time on the road. Nothing too exciting, just tried to make an honest living like everybody else." He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "These days I just try to enjoy being home, you know? Appreciate the simple things like browsing through a real store instead of shopping online, talking to people who actually know something about what they're selling." Sarah had been watching the exchange with growing curiosity. Something about this ordinary-looking man had shifted the energy in the shop, made her father more animated and engaged than she'd seen him in weeks. Frank was leaning forward, his face bright with genuine interest, in a way that reminded her of how he used to be before her mother's illness had drained the enthusiasm from his voice and posture. The customer continued browsing, stopping at a display of autographed baseballs arranged in a locked glass case. He picked up one signed by Johnny Bench, examining it with what Frank recognized as professional skepticism, the kind of careful assessment that separated serious collectors from casual buyers. "Authentic signature?" the man asked, his tone suggesting he'd know the difference. "Certificate of authenticity is right there," Frank said, pointing to the official paperwork displayed beside the baseball. "Got it directly from a card show in Louisville 2 years ago. Bench was signing for 3 hours straight, and I waited in line like everybody else to make sure I saw him sign it personally. Johnny's a good man, a real class act. Still lives around here, you know. Sometimes shops at the Kroger over in Anderson Township like he's just another guy buying groceries for his family." The customer set the ball down with careful respect. "That's what I always admired about the Cincinnati guys from that era. They never forgot where they came from, never acted like they were too good for their hometown." Frank found himself nodding enthusiastically, feeling a surge of validation from someone who clearly understood and appreciated the deeper significance of what he was trying to preserve. This was the kind of conversation that reminded him why he'd fallen in love with the business in the first place. Not just the buying and selling, but the stories, the human connections, the shared passion for the game, and its rich history. "You know what's interesting?" Frank said, warming to his subject with the enthusiasm of someone finally finding an audience that understood. "I've been running this place for almost 30 years, and the best customers are always the ones who really know the game inside and out. Not necessarily the biggest spenders, but the people who understand what all this stuff really represents beyond just its monetary value." The customer nodded thoughtfully, his expression suggesting someone who'd given the subject considerable thought. "It's not really about the money, is it? It's about preserving something important, keeping the stories alive, making sure the next generation understands what came before them." "Exactly." Frank felt a rush of connection with this stranger, who seemed to intuitively grasp what he'd been trying to explain to skeptics for decades. These aren't just collectibles gathering dust on shelves. They're pieces of living history. Every bat, every card, every photograph tells a story about moments that mattered to people, about dreams and achievements, and the human drama that makes sports meaningful. Sarah watched her father's face transform as he talked, seeing him become animated and passionate in a way she'd worried was gone forever. The mysterious customer had somehow brought out the best version of Frank Murphy, the enthusiastic curator and storyteller who'd built this business on genuine love for the game rather than just commercial interest. The customer spent another 20 minutes browsing, asking thoughtful questions about provenance and sharing observations that revealed an encyclopedic knowledge of baseball history spanning multiple decades. He knew obscure statistics that most casual fans had never heard, remembered specific games from the 1970s with photographic clarity, and had informed opinions about players and managers that suggested someone who'd been much more than a casual observer of the sport. Finally, he approached the counter with a modest but carefully chosen selection: the Pete Rose rookie card, a vintage Cincinnati Reds pennant from 1975, and a black and white photograph of Old Crossley Field during its heyday. "That'll be $85, Frank said, though he was already reaching for his pen to adjust the prices downward. Something about this customer's genuine appreciation for the items made him want to be generous, to reward someone who understood their true value. The man pulled out a worn leather wallet and counted out exact change, then added a $20 tip, with the casual generosity of someone who'd learned to appreciate good service. "For the conversation," he said simply. "Haven't talked real baseball with someone who knows the game in quite a while." Frank tried to protest the unnecessary generosity, but the customer was already headed for the door with his purchases carefully wrapped in tissue paper. He paused at the threshold and looked back with that same mysterious smile that had intrigued Frank from the beginning. "Keep fighting the good fight," he said, his voice carrying unexpected weight. "A place like this is more important than you probably realize. Don't let them convince you otherwise." And then he was gone, leaving Frank and Sarah staring at each other across the suddenly quiet shop, both feeling like they'd experienced something significant, but unable to quite define what it had been. "Who the hell was that?" Sarah asked, her voice mixing confusion with genuine amazement. Frank shook his head slowly, still processing the encounter. "I honestly have no idea, but I haven't felt that good about a sale in months, maybe years." The customer's parting words echoed in Frank's mind for the rest of the day, like a song he couldn't quite remember, but couldn't forget. More important than you probably realize. No, what had he meant by that? And why did Frank feel like he'd just met someone truly significant, even though the man had seemed perfectly ordinary on the surface? That evening, alone in the shop after Sarah had gone home to her apartment, Frank found himself going through old baseball guides, statistics books, and memorabilia catalogs, trying to place the familiar feeling the customer had triggered. Something about the man's mannerisms, the way he'd handled the Pete Rose memorabilia with such intimate familiarity, nagged at him like a crossword puzzle clue that should be obvious but remained frustratingly elusive. The shop felt different after hours, quieter but somehow more alive with memories. This was where Frank often felt closest to his late wife Margaret, surrounded by the accumulated dreams and artifacts they'd collected together over nearly 3 decades. She used to sit in the corner reading paperback novels while he organized merchandise and planned for tomorrow's possibilities that always seemed brighter in the fading daylight than they did in the harsh reality of morning sales figures. Margaret had possessed an intuitive understanding of people that Frank had always envied and relied upon. She could size up a customer within minutes, knowing instinctively who was a serious collector, who was just browsing, and who might become a regular if treated with the right combination of knowledge and respect. That man was different, she would have said about today's mysterious customer. He wasn't just looking at those items, he was remembering them. Wednesday morning brought unexpected activity that caught both Frank and Sarah off guard. Word had somehow gotten around that Murphy's Sports Haven had quality merchandise at reasonable prices, and Frank found himself busier than he'd been in weeks. A serious collector from Lexington drove up specifically to examine vintage St. Louis Cardinals items, spending over an hour carefully inspecting each piece before making several substantial purchases. 2 separate customers called asking about specific items they'd heard he might have in stock, and a local lawyer stopped by looking for authentic Cincinnati Reds memorabilia to decorate his new office. "Did you put an advertisement somewhere?" Sarah asked during a brief lull between customers. "Or maybe post something on social media? This is the most traffic we've had on a Wednesday in months." Frank shook his head, equally puzzled by the sudden uptick in business. "Maybe that gentleman from yesterday spread the word somehow. You know how collectors talk to each other. They're always sharing information about good finds and reputable dealers. Around 2 o'clock, Frank was helping an elderly man select an appropriate gift for his grandson's birthday when he noticed someone familiar browsing near the Pete Rose display case. It was yesterday's customer back again, this time wearing a different Cincinnati Reds cap and a polo shirt that had obviously seen better days, but was clean and pressed with the care of someone who took pride in his appearance, regardless of his clothes age. "Good afternoon," Frank called out, genuinely pleased to see the man return. "Back for more browsing, or did something specific bring you in today?" The man looked up with that same enigmatic smile that Frank was beginning to find both intriguing and slightly mysterious. "Actually, I was wondering if you might have any more of those Crossley Field photographs. The one I bought yesterday really brought back some memories, took me places I hadn't been in a long time." Frank's pulse quickened with the possibility of a substantial sale. He did have more Crossley Field memorabilia, carefully stored in the back room because the items had been too expensive to display prominently during the recent months of financial struggle. "I might have something special in storage." "What era were you thinking about? Early days, or maybe the later years?" "Oh, I don't know exactly. Maybe late 60s, early 70s, when the Big Red Machine was really starting to come together, before they became household names." The customer's eyes took on a distant quality. Those were exciting times in Cincinnati baseball. You could feel something special building with that team. As Frank headed to the storage room, his mind was racing with possibilities and suspicions. The way the customer had said Big Red Machine with such casual familiarity, the specific time frame he'd mentioned, the intimate knowledge he'd displayed yesterday, it all felt too detailed and personal for a casual fan, even a very knowledgeable one. Frank had been around enough former players over the years to recognize the subtle signs, and this man exhibited all the characteristics of someone who'd been part of the game at its highest professional level. He returned with a carefully organized box of photographs, spreading them across the counter with the reverence of a museum curator revealing rare artifacts. The customer's eyes immediately locked onto one particular image, a dynamic action shot of Pete Rose diving headfirst into third base, his uniform dirty and grass-stained, his face a mask of pure determination and competitive fire. "Now that's baseball," the man said quietly, picking up the photograph with obvious emotion. "Look at that absolute commitment. That guy never took a single play off, never coasted, never assumed anything was guaranteed. Every slide, every swing, every time he ran to first base, he gave everything he had." Frank studied the customer's face as he examined the photograph, noting the deeply personal quality in his expression. This wasn't the detached appreciation of a fan looking at sports memorabilia. This was someone examining what felt like family photographs, personal history made tangible. "You know," Frank said carefully, testing his growing suspicion, "you talk about Rose like you knew him personally, like you were there watching from up close rather than from the stands." The customer looked up sharply, and for a moment Frank saw something flicker in his eyes, caution perhaps, or the kind of careful calculation that came from years of being in the public eye. Then the expression was gone, replaced by that familiar easy smile that seemed designed to deflect deeper inquiry. "Just a devoted fan," he said with practiced casualness, "but I followed his career pretty closely, probably closer than most people." Hard not to when you grew up in Cincinnati watching those incredible teams play, but Frank wasn't satisfied with the deflection. Something about this man's knowledge went far beyond even the most dedicated amateur historian or passionate fan. The way he'd commented about Johnny Bench shopping at Kroger like a regular person, the intimate details about Pete Rose's playing style and competitive nature, the casual authority with which he discussed baseball history, it all suggested someone who'd been on the inside, looking out, not the outside looking in. "The thing about Rose," Frank continued, watching the customer's reaction carefully, "is that people either love him or hate him, with very little middle ground. But the people who actually knew him, who played with him or against him, they all say the same thing. Nobody worked harder or cared more about winning." The customer nodded slowly, his fingers tracing the edge of the Pete Rose photograph. "That's exactly right. Win or lose, he left everything on the field. Some people called it showing off, but it wasn't about attention. It was about respect. Respect for the game, for his teammates, for the fans who paid their hard-earned money to watch." "You sound like you might have had some personal experience with that kind of competitive drive," Frank said, his voice gentle but probing. For a long moment, the customer was silent, still looking down at the photograph. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of experience that seemed to confirm Frank's growing suspicions. I suppose I did, in my own way. Different circumstances, maybe. But I always believed that if something was worth doing, it was worth doing with everything you had. No shortcuts, no half measures, no saving something for later because later might never come. That evening, after the customer had made another modest purchase and left with the same polite mystery that characterized all his interactions, Frank found himself pulling out boxes of old newspapers and magazines from his personal collection. These weren't items for sale. They were his own archive of Cincinnati baseball history, accumulated over decades of passionate following. If this man was who Frank was beginning to suspect he might be, there would be evidence somewhere in the historical record. Frank started with 1970s Cincinnati Enquirer sports sections, methodically looking through game coverage, team photographs, and feature articles. Then he moved to national magazines like Sports Illustrated and The Sporting News, searching for anything that might confirm or refute his growing theory. Sarah arrived with Chinese takeout around 8 o'clock and found her father surrounded by yellowing newspapers, squinting at decades-old photographs through a magnifying glass with the intensity of a detective investigating a cold case. "Dad, what in the world are you doing? You look like you're investigating a murder or trying to solve some kind of historical mystery." Frank looked up from a 1976 Sports Illustrated cover featuring the big red machine, his eyes bright with excitement for the first time in months. The magazine showed the entire Cincinnati Reds starting lineup, and Frank had been comparing faces with his memory of their mysterious customer. Sarah. That customer who's been coming in. I think I know who he is. "Okay," Sarah said slowly, setting down the takeout containers and preparing herself for what might be another one of her father's optimistic theories. "Who do you think he is?" Frank hesitated, knowing exactly how crazy it would sound when he said it out loud. "I think it might be Pete Rose." Sarah nearly choked on the lo mein she'd just started eating. "Dad, come on." "Pete Rose? The actual Pete Rose? Charlie Hustle himself? Why on earth would Pete Rose be shopping in our little memorabilia store?" "Think about it logically," Frank said, warming to his theory with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been mulling it over for hours. "The guy knows way too much about baseball history, not just statistics that any fan might know, but insider details, personal observations about players' personalities and habits. He handled that vintage bat yesterday, like he'd used one professionally for years. He talked about Johnny Bench and the other big red machine players like they were old friends, not just players he'd watched on television." Frank pulled out his laptop and began searching for recent photographs of Pete Rose, comparing them with his mental image of their customer. And did you notice how he reacted to the Rose memorabilia? He wasn't looking at those items like a fan or collector. He was looking at them like someone seeing pictures of himself, reliving his own memories. Sarah shook her head, but Frank could see her skepticism beginning to waver as she considered the evidence. "I mean, okay, maybe there's a physical resemblance if you squint and use your imagination. But Dad, this is Pete Rose we're talking about. The Hit King. One of the most famous baseball players in history. Why would he be quietly shopping at Murphy's Sports Haven instead of making appearances at major card shows where he could charge hundreds of dollars for autographs? Maybe because it's the one place in Cincinnati where he can just be a regular person," Frank said quietly, the insight coming to him as he spoke. "Think about it from his perspective. Everywhere else he goes, he's Pete Rose, the controversial figure, the guy who's banned from the Hall of Fame, the subject of endless debates about gambling and redemption. Here, nobody recognized him. He could just be another middle-aged baseball fan, looking at cards and remembering better times." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, studying the magazine photographs and considering the possibility that their modest family business had somehow attracted one of baseball's most legendary and controversial figures. "Even if you're right, and I'm not saying you are, what exactly are you planning to do about it? Confront him, ask for an autograph, risk embarrassing him if you're wrong, or violating his privacy if you're right?" Frank hadn't thought that far ahead. His first instinct had been to somehow confirm his suspicion, maybe acknowledge who he thought the man was, and express his admiration for Pete Rose's career achievements. But something held him back, a sense that if Pete Rose was indeed shopping at his store, precisely because it offered anonymity and normal human interaction, then revealing that anonymity would be a profound betrayal of trust. "I don't know," Frank admitted, closing the laptop and leaning back in his chair. "Maybe nothing. Maybe just let him keep being a regular customer who happens to know a lot about baseball. If he wanted people to know who he was, he would have introduced himself." Sarah smiled at her father's evident excitement and moral dilemma. It had been months since she'd seen him this energized about anything related to the shop, this engaged with the possibilities that each day might bring. Even if he was completely wrong about their customer's identity, the mystery had rekindled something in Frank that she'd feared was gone forever. A sense of wonder, a belief that remarkable things could still happen in ordinary places. "Well," she said, reaching across to squeeze his hand, "I guess we'll find out tomorrow whether your mystery man comes back for a third visit." That night, Frank lay awake thinking about second chances, hidden identities, and the strange ways life sometimes offered unexpected gifts when you most needed them. If their mysterious customer really was Pete Rose, then baseball's most controversial figure was choosing to spend his time in a failing sports shop in Cincinnati, looking at memories of his former glory with the wistful appreciation of someone who understood that fame was temporary, but genuine passion for the game was eternal. And if Frank was completely wrong about the man's identity, well, at least the mystery had reminded him why he'd fallen in love with baseball in the first place. Not just the statistics and the memorabilia, but the human stories, the personal connections, the way the game had the power to bring together people across generations and social boundaries. Either way, Frank thought as he finally began to drift off to sleep, tomorrow couldn't come soon enough. The possibility that Pete Rose might walk through his door again made even their financial problems seem temporarily manageable, overshadowed by the promise that sometimes extraordinary things happen to ordinary people who kept their doors open and their hearts ready for surprise. Thursday morning arrived with the kind of crisp October air that made baseball fans nostalgic for playoff games, World Series dreams, and the eternal hope that this year might be different from all the disappointing years that came before. Frank opened Murphy's Sports Haven with unusual anticipation, wondering if their mysterious customer would return for a third consecutive day, and if today might finally bring clarity to the suspicions that had kept him awake most of the night. He'd spent the early morning hours rearranging the Pete Rose display, not really changing anything substantial, but finding excuses to handle each item, to study the photographs, and signed memorabilia with fresh eyes, searching for clues he might have missed. The rookie card their customer had purchased Tuesday seemed to stare back at him from its now empty spot in the display case, as if mocking his amateur detective work. Sarah arrived with coffee and fresh pastries from the German bakery 3 blocks away, a small luxury they couldn't really afford, but that felt necessary somehow, like putting on good clothes for an important meeting or cleaning the house before company arrived. The morning rush of commuters and early shoppers provided a steady trickle of customers, nothing spectacular, but enough activity to keep the register drawer from feeling completely empty and to maintain the illusion that Murphy's Sports Haven was still a viable business. "Any sign of your mystery man?" Sarah asked during a mid-morning lull, glancing toward the front door with obvious curiosity. Frank shook his head, trying to hide his disappointment and telling himself that he'd been foolish to expect the pattern to continue indefinitely. Maybe the guy had gotten what he came for, satisfied his nostalgia, and moved on to other ways of spending his retirement time. Maybe Frank had read far too much into a couple of casual visits from a knowledgeable baseball fan who happened to bear a passing resemblance to a famous player. Around 11:30, just as Frank was beginning to accept that yesterday's excitement had been premature and probably delusional, the familiar bell chimed, and there he was. Same understated presence, same casual dress, but this time Frank noticed additional details he'd missed during previous visits. The way the man automatically scanned the shop before fully entering, as if checking for recognition or potential complications. The slight limp that suggested old athletic injuries, the careful, economical way he moved that spoke of someone who'd learned to conserve energy and avoid unnecessary risks. "Good morning," the customer said, approaching the counter where Frank stood, pretending to sort through a new shipment of trading cards while actually watching the door. "How's business treating you today?" "Getting better, actually," Frank replied, studying the man's face with new intensity and becoming more convinced by the minute that his theory was correct. "You're becoming quite the regular customer. We should probably start offering you a frequent buyer discount." "Duh." A slight smile played at the corners of the customer's mouth. "Maybe I just like the atmosphere in here. Reminds me of the old neighborhood shops from when I was growing up, before everything went corporate and impersonal. Places where the owner actually knew something about what he was selling." Frank made a decision that felt both terrifying and necessary. "You know, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, about Pete Rose and whether he got a raw deal from baseball. He watched the customer's reaction carefully, looking for any telltale signs. I always wondered what it would be like to meet him face to face, to ask him directly about the gambling, the controversy, whether he has any regrets about the choices that cost him the Hall of Fame. The customer went very still, his hands pausing over a display of vintage team pennants. For a long moment, the only sounds in the shop were the persistent hum of fluorescent lights, the distant murmur of traffic outside, and Frank's own heartbeat thundering in his ears. "What would you ask him?" the man said finally, his voice carefully neutral, but carrying an undertone of genuine curiosity. Frank felt his pulse racing, but pressed forward, committed now to seeing where this conversation would lead. "I guess I'd ask if it was worth it. The gambling, I mean. If he knew what it would ultimately cost him, the Hall of Fame, his reputation, his place in baseball history, would he do things differently? Or are there some mistakes so fundamental that they become part of who you are, impossible to separate from everything else?" The customer picked up a 1975 Cincinnati Reds pennant, examining it with the same careful attention he'd shown everything else. But Frank could see tension in his shoulders now, a wariness that hadn't been present in their previous interactions. This was a man who'd learned to be cautious about personal questions, who'd developed defenses against inquiries that cut too close to sensitive truths. "That's a hell of a question," the man said quietly, his voice carrying weight and experience that seemed to confirm Frank's suspicions. Probably not one he could answer easily, even if he wanted to. "Some things you live with, rather than explain." Sarah had emerged from the back office and was watching the conversation with growing understanding. Frank caught her eye and saw his own recognition reflected there, along with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. This wasn't just another customer browsing memorabilia. This was something much more significant, a moment that could change their understanding of who walked through their doors and why. "You know what I think?" Frank continued, his voice gentler now, less confrontational and more empathetic. "I think he's probably asked himself that same question every single day for the past 30-plus years. And I think the answer changes depending on what kind of day he's having, whether he's feeling regret or defiance, whether he's focusing on what he lost or what he accomplished." The customer set down the pennant and looked directly at Frank for the first time since the conversation had turned personal and potentially dangerous. In that moment, Frank saw something in the man's eyes that confirmed everything he'd suspected: recognition, resignation, and maybe just a little relief that the pretense could finally end. "You know who I am," Pete Rose said. It wasn't a question. Frank nodded slowly, feeling a strange mixture of vindication and responsibility. "I figured it out yesterday evening, going through old magazines and newspaper clippings. The way you talked about the game, about the other players, about specific moments in Cincinnati baseball history. Plus, you handled that merchandise like someone who lived it from the inside, not someone who just watched it happen." Pete sighed deeply and leaned against the counter, suddenly looking every one of his 73 years. The careful composure he'd maintained during their previous interactions seemed to melt away, replaced by the weary acceptance of someone who'd been carrying a heavy burden for far too long. "How long have you actually known?" Pete asked, genuine curiosity mixing with resignation in his voice. "Suspected it yesterday, became pretty sure this morning when you walked in. But don't worry, we haven't told anybody, and we're not going to. This is your business, your choice about what you want people to know." Sarah stepped forward, her voice soft with something approaching awe, but also respect for the magnitude of the moment. "Mr. Rose, what are you doing here? I mean, in our little shop specifically? There must be dozens of sports memorabilia stores in Cincinnati." Pete looked around Murphy's Sports Haven as if seeing it clearly for the first time, taking in the faded pennants, the worn carpet, the slightly shabby but genuine authenticity that corporate stores could never replicate. "Honestly, I've been driving around Cincinnati for weeks, just remembering things, visiting places that meant something to me back when life was simpler. I went by the old neighborhoods where I grew up, drove past where Crosley Field used to stand, stopped at some of the restaurants where the team used to eat after games." He paused, running a hand through his gray hair with a gesture that seemed unconscious and habitual. "I saw your shop from the street and figured I'd take a quick look, maybe buy something small as a souvenir. Turned out to be exactly what I needed without knowing I needed it." Frank felt a surge of understanding that went beyond mere customer service. Everywhere else you go, you're Pete Rose the story, Pete Rose the controversy, Pete Rose the guy who can't get into the Hall of Fame. Here you were, just another customer who happened to know a lot about baseball. Exactly, Pete said, his voice carrying gratitude and exhaustion in equal measure. Do you have any idea how rare that is? I can't go to most card shows anymore without it turning into a media circus. Can't browse a sports shop without people wanting pictures, asking about the gambling, wanting me to relitigate decisions I made 40 years ago. But here, for a few precious minutes over the past couple days, I could just remember why I fell in love with this game in the first place. Sarah was staring at Pete with obvious fascination, still processing the reality of having one of baseball's most legendary figures standing in their modest family business. The Hit King, she murmured wonderingly. 4,256 hits. Dad, do you realize who we're talking to? I realize, Frank said quietly, and I realize why he chose not to tell us immediately. The question is, what happens now? Pete's expression sharpened with interest. What do you mean, what happens now? Frank and Sarah exchanged glances, and suddenly the whole story came pouring out. Margaret's illness and death, the mounting medical bills that had drained their savings, the declining neighborhood business environment, the competition from online sellers, the looming deadline from creditors who were running out of patience. Pete listened without interruption, his face growing more serious and thoughtful with each detail they shared. How much money do you actually need to stay afloat? He asked when they finished their financial confession. Frank shook his head quickly, embarrassed by the implication. No, we didn't tell you all that to ask for money or charity. We just wanted you to understand why meeting you, having you appreciate what we're trying to do here with preserving baseball history, it means more than you probably realize. It reminded us why this work matters. Now, Pete was quiet for a long moment, studying the shop with what Frank now recognized as a businessman's calculating assessment. Despite all his controversies and personal struggles, Rose had always been intelligent about money, opportunity, and the practical realities of making a living in and around professional sports. You know, Pete said finally, I've been thinking about doing some private signings. Small groups, serious collectors, people who really understand and appreciate the game, rather than just wanting to make money flipping autographs on eBay. Nothing big or public, just intimate sessions where I can actually talk to people about baseball instead of just signing things as fast as possible. He gestured around the shop with obvious appreciation. A place like this would be perfect for something like that. Private, comfortable, authentic atmosphere. And it would bring in exactly the kind of customers who would appreciate the quality and authenticity of what you're selling here. Frank stared at him in disbelief. You're talking about hosting Pete Rose signing events? Here at Murphy's Sports Haven? Why not? Pete's smile was genuine for the first time since Frank had known his true identity. I need a venue where I can control the environment, meet real fans and collectors, instead of just dealers and speculators looking to make a quick profit. You need customers who understand the real value of what you're offering and are willing to pay fair prices for authentic merchandise. He paused, looking directly at both Frank and Sarah. Seems like we might be able to help each other out. I get a comfortable place to do business with people who respect the game, and you get access to the kind of collectors who drive hundreds of miles for authentic memorabilia and don't mind paying what it's actually worth. Sarah was practically vibrating with excitement, her business training allowing her to immediately grasp the implications of what Pete was proposing. Dad, do you understand what this could mean? Pete Rose signing events at Murphy's Sports Haven. We'd have serious collectors driving in from 5 states, maybe more. The publicity alone would... But Frank was studying Pete's face intently, looking for the catch he was certain must be coming. 30 years in retail had taught him that deals that sounded too good to be true usually were, especially when they involved celebrities and large amounts of potential money. What would you want in return, besides whatever percentage of the signing fees we agreed on? Pete's smile widened, and for the first time since Frank had suspected his identity, it looked completely genuine and unguarded. Just what you've already given me, Frank. A place where Pete Rose can walk in, look at some baseball cards, talk about the game with people who understand it, and remember why he used to love playing before everything got so complicated and controversial. Frank extended his hand across the counter, feeling like he was about to shake hands with history itself. So Charlie Hustle himself wants to partner with Murphy's Sports Haven. Pete gripped Frank's hand firmly, his calloused palm speaking of decades spent gripping baseball bats and making the kind of contact that had made him famous. Charlie Hustle wants to help save Murphy's Sports Haven. and maybe find a little redemption in the process, if that's not asking too much from the universe. A dream. As they shook hands, Frank felt something fundamental shift in the world around them. 3 days ago, he'd been ready to give up on his life's work, convinced that small businesses like his had no place in the modern economy. Now, he was entering into a partnership with one of baseball's greatest and most controversial legends, planning events that could not only save his shop, but transform it into something larger and more meaningful than he'd ever imagined possible. Outside, Cincinnati continued its daily rhythm, unaware that inside a small sports memorabilia shop on a declining commercial street, two men who understood the true meaning of second chances were about to embark on an unlikely partnership that would change both their lives in ways neither could fully anticipate. 3 weeks later, Murphy's Sports Haven was buzzing with an energy and excitement Frank hadn't experienced since the early days of his ownership, back when the neighborhood was thriving and baseball memorabilia was considered a solid investment rather than a nostalgic indulgence. The first, Pete Rose, private signing had been scheduled for the upcoming Saturday, and advance word had spread through the collector community like wildfire through dry grass, generating more interest than Frank had seen in years of conventional business operations. Frank's phone hadn't stopped ringing with inquiries from serious collectors, casual fans, and curious onlookers who'd heard rumors about the Hit King making personal appearances at a small Cincinnati memorabilia shop. Sarah had created a carefully managed waiting list that was already twice as long as the venue could safely accommodate, forcing them to plan additional sessions and establish strict protocols for managing demand without compromising the intimate atmosphere that Pete had specifically requested. The transformation was remarkable and went far beyond mere commercial success. Pete had been true to his word, visiting the shop regularly but now openly, no longer hiding behind the pretense of anonymity that had initially brought them together. When he stopped trying to be invisible, his natural charisma and deep knowledge of baseball history filled the small space like stadium lights, illuminating a night game, drawing people in and keeping them engaged for hours longer than they'd originally planned to stay. You know what the real difference was between the Big Red Machine and all those other great teams from the 70s? Pete was saying to a group of collectors who'd gathered around him Thursday afternoon, hanging on every word like students in the presence of a master teacher. It wasn't just the individual talent, though Lord knows we had plenty of that with Bench, Morgan, Perez, Foster, and the rest. It was that we genuinely liked each other as human beings. We weren't just teammates sharing a clubhouse. We were friends who happened to play professional baseball together. You can't fake that kind of chemistry, and you can't buy it with free agent contracts. Frank watched from behind the counter, still amazed by how naturally Pete commanded attention without seeming to try, how he could take a simple question about batting averages and turn it into a fascinating story about team dynamics, personal relationships, and the psychology of winning. The controversial figure who'd been banned from baseball's highest honors was, in person, simply a man who loved the game with infectious passion and possessed an encyclopedic memory for the human details that made statistics meaningful. "Mr. Murphy," called out a customer from the Pete Rose memorabilia section, "do you have any more of these signed 1975 World Series programs? My nephew just started playing Little League, and I want to give him something that shows what Cincinnati baseball was like during the greatest era in franchise history." Frank smiled and headed over to help, but not before catching Pete's eye and receiving a subtle thumbs up. Their agreed-upon signal that everything was proceeding well, and Frank should focus on being the knowledgeable, helpful shopkeeper he'd always been, rather than getting starstruck by his famous partner. The signing events had solved their immediate financial crisis in spectacular fashion, bringing in more revenue in 3 weeks than they'd generated in the previous 6 months combined. But more importantly, the partnership had restored Frank's faith in what he was doing and why it mattered. The shop was busy throughout the week now, not just during special events, as Pete's presence had attracted serious collectors who'd subsequently discovered Frank's knowledgeable curation, fair pricing, and genuine commitment to preserving baseball history rather than simply maximizing profits. Word was spreading through collector networks that Murphy's Sports Haven was a place where you could find quality items, honest dealing, and the kind of authentic baseball atmosphere that corporate sports retailers could never replicate. Customers were driving in from neighboring states, and Frank had received inquiries from as far away as Chicago, Detroit, and St. Louis from people planning trips to Cincinnati specifically to visit the shop where Pete Rose made regular appearances. Sarah had thrown herself into the partnership with characteristic determination and business acumen, handling publicity, logistics, and customer management, while Frank focused on inventory, authentication, and the day-to-day operations that kept the shop running smoothly. The work was demanding, but exhilarating, and she'd even started dating again, a corporate lawyer named David Chen, who'd attended the first signing event and asked her out over a spirited debate about whether Johnny Bench was the greatest catcher in baseball history or merely one of the top three. "Dad," Sarah said during a quiet moment Friday evening as they prepared for Saturday's signing, their biggest event yet, with 40 collectors coming from as far away as Chicago, Atlanta, and even Boston. "I need to ask you something serious." Frank looked up from the inventory sheets he'd been meticulously updating, making sure they had adequate supplies of authentication certificates, protective sleeves, and display materials for the weekend's activities. The shop was officially closed, but they were working late to prepare for what would be their most ambitious event yet. "What's on your mind, sweetheart?" Sarah hesitated, then settled onto the stool beside him with the serious expression she'd inherited from her mother. The look that meant she was about to ask difficult questions that needed honest answers. "Are you truly happy with how things are going? I mean genuinely happy, not just relieved that we're making money again. Because 3 months ago, you were ready to walk away from all this, and now you're busier than you've been in years. Sometimes I worry we're just postponing the inevitable rather than actually solving our long-term problems." Frank set down his pen and really looked at his daughter, seeing the concern in her eyes and realizing that he'd been so focused on the immediate success of their Pete Rose partnership that he hadn't considered whether she wanted her future tied to the memorabilia business indefinitely. At 26, she had her whole life ahead of her, with opportunities and possibilities that extended far beyond helping her father run a small sports shop in a declining Cincinnati neighborhood. "Are you asking if I'm happy or if you're happy?" Frank said gently. Sarah smiled, but he could see the complexity of emotions behind the expression. "Both, I guess. This partnership with Pete has been absolutely incredible, and I love seeing you excited about the business again. But what happens when the novelty wears off for collectors? What happens if Pete decides he wants to do something else? Or if his legal troubles get worse? Or if people just get tired of driving to Cincinnati for autographs?" It was a fair and intelligent question, one that Frank had been asking himself during quiet moments when the excitement of recent success gave way to more practical considerations. The Pete Rose signings had provided immediate financial relief and generated tremendous publicity, but they'd also made Murphy's sports haven dependent on a man who'd built his reputation on being unpredictable and who remained a controversial figure in the baseball world. "You know what I learned from your mother during her illness," Frank said slowly, choosing his words carefully. "That you can't live your entire life preparing for the worst thing that might happen. Sometimes you have to trust that if you do good work with good people, if you treat others with respect and integrity, things have a way of working out even when you can't see exactly how." Before Sarah could respond, they heard a familiar knock on the front door. Through the glass, they could see Pete Rose standing under the streetlight, holding a paper bag and wearing what looked like an apologetic expression mixed with barely contained excitement. Frank unlocked the door, noting that Pete seemed more energized than usual. "Pete, we're closed for the evening. Is everything okay?" "Yeah, sorry to bother you folks so late. I was driving by and saw the lights on, figured you might be here preparing for tomorrow." Pete held up the bag with obvious significance. "I brought something I thought you might like to see, something that might interest you given our conversation yesterday about expanding the business." They gathered around the counter as Pete carefully removed items from the bag with the reverence of someone handling religious artifacts. A game-used bat from his 1963 rookie season, its wood scarred and darkened from countless hits. His National League Rookie of the Year trophy from that same season, and a baseball from his 492nd hit. The swing that broke Ty Cobb's all-time record and should have guaranteed his place in the Hall of Fame. Frank felt his breath catch as he realized what he was looking at. These weren't just collectibles or memorabilia, they were artifacts of baseball history, items that belonged in the Cooperstown Museum that Pete would never be allowed to enter because of his gambling ban. "Pete," Frank said quietly, his voice filled with awe and concern, "these are absolutely priceless. They're pieces of American sports history. Why are you showing them to us?" Pete picked up the baseball, turning it slowly in his weathered hands with an expression that mixed pride, regret, and something that looked like hope. "Because I've been thinking about what you said that first day we met, about preserving the stories, keeping the history alive for people who care about more than just statistics and dollar values." These things have been sitting in my house for years, and what good are they doing there? Maybe it's time they were somewhere people could actually see them, appreciate them, learn from them. Sarah leaned forward, her business instincts immediately grasping the implications. You're talking about putting them on permanent display here? Maybe. Or maybe something bigger and more ambitious. Pete set down the ball and looked around the shop with an expression that seemed to envision possibilities beyond its current modest dimensions. Frank, what would you say to expanding this place significantly? Not just memorabilia sales, but a real museum experience, Cincinnati baseball history, big red machine exhibits, interactive displays that tell the story of the game in this city. Make Murphy's Sports Haven a genuine destination, not just a shop. Frank stared at him, struggling to process the magnitude of what Pete was proposing. Pete, that would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe more. The renovation, the displays, the insurance, the permits. I know exactly what it would cost, and I know people who might be interested in investing in something like that. Pete's eyes were bright with the same competitive fire that had made him Charlie Hustle. Cincinnati needs a place that celebrates its baseball heritage properly, tells the complete story from the early days through the big red machine and beyond. And you've already proven you know how to do this kind of work with integrity and authenticity. Sarah was practically bouncing with excitement, her earlier concerns about long-term viability suddenly seeming less relevant. Dad, think about the possibilities. A real baseball museum, with the shop as part of it but not the whole thing. We could honor the entire history of Cincinnati baseball, not just one player or one era. Educational programs, guided tours, special exhibitions. Frank felt overwhelmed by the scope of what Pete was suggesting. But Pete, why us? Why this particular place? There must be investors and developers who could create something much more professional and sophisticated. Pete smiled, and Frank saw in it the same boyish enthusiasm that had made him one of baseball's most beloved figures before the controversy overshadowed his achievements. Because you believed in the importance of what you were doing even when nobody else seemed to care. Because you treated an old controversial ex-ball player like just another customer who happened to love the game. Because you understand that this isn't really about making money. It's about preserving something precious and sharing it with people who will value it. He gestured toward the memorabilia surrounding them, the faded pennants and worn photographs that told the story of Cincinnati's rich baseball heritage. I made mistakes, Frank, big ones that cost me the Hall of Fame, my reputation, relationships with people I cared about. But maybe there's still time to do something meaningful with whatever years I've got left, something that honors the game instead of just profiting from it. Frank looked around the shop that had been his life's work for 3 decades, imagining it expanded into something that could preserve and share Cincinnati's baseball heritage with future generations of fans, students, and tourists. Then he looked at Pete Rose, flawed, human, still passionate about the game that had given him everything and taken away just as much. You really think we could pull something like that off? Create something that would do justice to Cincinnati baseball history? Pete's grin was pure Charlie Hustle, the expression of someone who'd spent his entire career betting on himself when others said he couldn't succeed. Frank, I spent 24 years in the major leagues, proving that hard work and determination could overcome natural limitations. You spent 30 years keeping this place alive when everybody said small businesses were dead. Between the two of us, I'd say we know a little something about beating the odds when it matters. Saturday morning arrived grey and cold, with the kind of October weather that made people think about World Series games and championship dreams. By 9 o'clock, collectors were lined up outside Murphy's Sports Haven, despite the temperature, their breath visible in the crisp air as they discussed rare finds, authentication techniques, and their hopes for items they'd brought for Pete to sign. Frank had arrived at 7 to prepare, arranging tables, setting up authentication stations, and making sure they had adequate supplies for what promised to be their busiest day ever. Pete showed up shortly after with coffee and donuts for the waiting customers, a gesture that immediately set the tone for what would be a special day and demonstrated the kind of personal attention that separated their events from impersonal commercial signings. The signing session lasted 6 hours, but it felt like minutes to Frank as he watched Pete connect with fans in a way that reminded everyone why he'd been such a beloved figure before the gambling scandal changed everything. Pete was completely in his element, telling stories that couldn't be found in any statistics book, signing items with genuine care, and treating each customer like someone worth his full attention rather than just another transaction to be processed quickly. Near the end of the day, an elderly man approached Pete with a battered baseball that had obviously seen decades of use, its leather worn smooth and its stitching darkened with age and handling. "Mr. Rose," the man said nervously, his hands shaking slightly as he held the ball. "This was my son's baseball. He died in Vietnam in 1968, just 19 years old. But he was your biggest fan. Used to say he was going to play in the major leagues someday, just like Charlie Hustle, going to run to first base on every single play no matter what." Pete took the ball with obvious reverence, studying the worn leather and faded stitching as if it were a sacred relic. His usual quick wit and easy banter were replaced by solemn respect for the story he'd just heard. "What was your son's name, sir?" "Tommy Morrison. He would have turned 75 next month if he'd made it home from the war." Pete signed the ball carefully, taking extra time to make sure the signature was perfect, then handed it back with both hands in a gesture that seemed almost ceremonial. "Tommy Morrison was a hero, sir. And any young man who had a father like you was already playing in the big leagues, where it mattered most. Thank you for sharing his story with me." The old man's eyes filled with tears as he clutched the baseball to his chest like a precious treasure. "Thank you, Mr. Rose. This means more than I can possibly tell you. Tommy would have been so proud." Frank watched the exchange from across the shop, feeling his own eyes moisten as he witnessed the kind of moment that reminded him why sports memorabilia was about much more than commerce. This was why they did what they did, not for the money or the business success, but for moments like this, when pieces of cardboard and leather became bridges connecting people across time, loss, memory, and love. As the last customer left and they began the process of cleaning up and counting the day's proceeds, Pete pulled Frank aside for a private conversation. "You know what I realized today," Pete said, looking around the shop that had somehow become much more than either of them had imagined when they first shook hands 3 weeks ago. "I spent so many years thinking about what baseball cost me that I forgot what it gave me. Days like this, meeting people like that old man, sharing stories with kids who still believe in heroes, this is what it was always supposed to be about." Frank nodded, understanding completely. "Margaret used to say that the best businesses weren't really about buying and selling products. They were about giving people a place to belong, even if it was just for a few minutes, a place where their passions and interests were understood and valued." Pete picked up the baseball from his 4,192nd hit, the artifact he'd brought the night before to show them. Without ceremony or fanfare, he placed it carefully in the display case next to Frank's cash register, positioning it where customers would see it immediately when they entered the shop. "What are you doing?" Frank asked, startled by the gesture. "Giving it a home where people can see it and remember that records are made to be broken, but the love of the game is forever." Oh, Pete grinned with genuine warmth. "Besides, if we're going to be serious partners in this museum idea, we might as well start building the collection with something meaningful." Sarah finished counting the day's receipts and looked up with a smile that reminded Frank painfully of her mother's expression when she was particularly proud of something they'd accomplished together. "Dad, we made more money today than we usually make in 2 months." And Pete, the feedback from customers was absolutely incredible. They weren't just buying autographs, they were buying into something special, something they felt connected to. She paused, looking around the shop with new appreciation. People were asking about when the next event would be, whether we'd have other former players, if we were planning to expand. "I think we might actually have something here that could grow into what you're talking about." Frank looked around the shop that 3 months ago had seemed like a burden he couldn't bear to carry and couldn't afford to lose. Now it buzzed with possibility and promise, filled with the lingering energy of people who understood that baseball memorabilia wasn't really about the objects themselves, but about the memories and human connections they represented. The late afternoon sun slanted through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits celebrating the day's success. The familiar smells of old leather, cardboard, and decades of accumulated dreams seemed somehow richer now, enhanced by the knowledge that this place had become something larger than Frank had ever imagined possible. Outside, Cincinnati was settling into evening, but inside Murphy's Sports Haven, 3 people who had found each other at exactly the right moment were planning a future that honored the past while embracing the promise of second chances. Pete Rose might never make it into the Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, but he was helping create something equally important. a place where the love of the game could flourish, where stories could be preserved and shared, and where people like Tommy Morrison's father could find comfort in the enduring power of sports to connect human hearts across generations. Over the following weeks, their partnership deepened and evolved beyond what any of them had originally envisioned. Pete's contacts in the baseball world led to visits from other former Cincinnati players who were eager to support a venture that celebrated their shared history. Johnny Bench stopped by one afternoon, spending 2 hours telling stories and signing items for surprise customers. Joe Morgan called to express interest in participating in future events, and Tony Perez sent a signed jersey with a note promising to visit during his next trip to Cincinnati. The museum expansion project began to take concrete shape as Pete introduced Frank and Sarah to investors who understood the value of preserving baseball history. An architect who specialized in sports facilities drew up preliminary plans that would triple the shop's size while maintaining its intimate, authentic atmosphere. The proposed Cincinnati Baseball Heritage Museum would feature permanent exhibits on the Big Red Machine, interactive displays about the evolution of the game, and rotating exhibitions highlighting different aspects of the city's rich baseball tradition. Local media began paying attention to what was happening at Murphy's Sports Haven. The Cincinnati Enquirer ran a feature story about the unlikely partnership between Pete Rose and Frank Murphy, describing it as a heartwarming example of second chances and community support. ESPN contacted them about possibly filming a segment for one of their human interest programs, and the National Baseball Hall of Fame Library expressed interest in collaborating on historical research projects. But perhaps most importantly, the shop had become a gathering place for people who shared a genuine passion for baseball history and storytelling. Regular customers developed relationships with each other, sharing collecting tips, trading stories, and forming the kind of community that Frank had always hoped his business could foster. Children like Miguel came in with their grandparents, wide-eyed with wonder as they touched pieces of history and listened to Pete's stories about what it was really like to play professional baseball. One evening in late November, as the first snow of winter began falling outside, Frank and Pete sat alone in the shop after hours, surrounded by the artifacts and memories that had brought them together. "You know what surprises me most about all this?" Pete said, leaning back in his chair with the relaxed posture of someone who'd found peace with his circumstances. "It's not the money we're making or the publicity we're getting. It's how good it feels to be part of something positive again, something that makes people happy instead of disappointed." Frank nodded, understanding exactly what Pete meant. "For 30 years, I thought my job was just selling baseball cards and memorabilia. Turns out I was actually in the business of preserving stories and helping people connect with something larger than themselves." Pete picked up a photograph of the 1976 Cincinnati Reds, studying the faces of teammates who'd shared the greatest years of his career. "I spent so much time being angry about what I lost, the Hall of Fame, the recognition, the respect. I forgot about what I could still give, what I could still contribute to the game that made my life meaningful. Margaret always said that our mistakes don't define us unless we let them," Frank said quietly. She believed that every day was a chance to do something better than yesterday, to make choices that honored what was best in us rather than what was worst. As they prepared to close up and head home, Pete made one final gesture that captured the spirit of their unlikely partnership. He took out his wallet and pulled out a worn business card, writing something on the back before handing it to Frank. "What's this?" Frank asked, reading the card. "Pete Rose, partner, Murphy's Sports Haven and Cincinnati Baseball Heritage Museum." "My new business card," Pete said with a grin. "Figured it was about time I had something to give people that focused on the future instead of the past." Frank looked at the card, then at Pete, then around the shop that had been transformed by their partnership from a struggling business into something approaching a mission. "You know what, Pete? I think Charlie Hustle is back." "Never really left," Pete replied, putting on his coat and heading for the door. "Just needed the right team to play with again." "Indeed." As Pete disappeared into the snowy Cincinnati night, Frank turned off the lights and locked up Murphy's Sports Haven. But he felt more energized and hopeful than he had in years. Tomorrow would bring new customers, new stories, new opportunities to preserve and share the history that had brought them all together. The Hit King and the shopkeeper had discovered that sometimes the most important games are played long after the stadium lights go out. In small places where ordinary people gather to remember that heroes are human, second chances are possible, and the love of the game endures long after the final out is called. Outside, snow continued to fall on Cincinnati, covering the streets with the promise of a fresh start. Inside Murphy's sports haven, surrounded by the artifacts of America's pastime, the dream of preserving baseball history for future generations was stronger than ever. Pete Rose had found redemption not in a Hall of Fame plaque, but in the knowledge that his legacy would live on in the stories told and the connections made in a small shop where the past and present came together in perfect harmony. Frank Murphy had saved his family business, but more importantly, he had discovered that sometimes the greatest victories come not from winning, but from refusing to give up when everything seems lost. In partnering with Pete Rose, he had learned that second chances aren't just given. They're earned through persistence, integrity, and the willingness to believe that tomorrow might be better than today. The story of Murphy's sports haven and the Cincinnati Baseball Heritage Museum was just beginning, but it was already clear that when passion meets opportunity, when dreams encounter determination, and when flawed human beings choose to do something bigger than themselves, extraordinary things can happen in the most ordinary places. As Frank drove home through the falling snow, he could almost hear Margaret's voice whispering in the winter wind. "I told you not to give up, Frank Murphy. I told you baseball was in your blood," and for the first time since her death, he truly understood what she had meant. The game, it seemed, was far from over.